The Galactic Conquered had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever dared to challenge its authority openly. For the Conquered was not merely a government but a force of nature that crushed all who opposed it. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the entrance of the Grand Assembly Chamber on the orbital station called Ethon Prime, and she took a deep breath before stepping inside, knowing that today would determine humanity's future among the stars. The chamber was massive beyond human imagination, a dome of crystal and light that stretched for kilometers in every direction, filled with representatives from over 4,000 spacefaring species, each one older and more advanced than humanity, each one looking down at the young species from Earth with barely concealed contempt. Elena walked to the small platform designated for provisional members, a platform positioned lower than all the others, designed specifically to remind newcomers of their inferior status, and she held her head high despite the insult. Humanity had been a provisional member of the Conquered for 37 years now, always promised full membership, always told to wait just a little longer, always treated like children who needed supervision and guidance. Today Elena had come to request something simple, something that should have been routine: terraforming rights for Mars, humanity's closest neighbor, a dead world that no other species wanted or needed. She had been assured by her contacts that this would be a formality, a quick vote and nothing more. So when High Arbiter Zethkorin of the Velthari hegemony rose from his elevated throne and called for silence, Elena felt the first cold touch of fear in her stomach. Zethkorin was ancient even by galactic standards, his scaled body wrapped in robes of office that sparkled with embedded gemstones from 100 conquered worlds, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia. "Before we address the human request," he announced, his translator rendering his words in perfect English, "the hegemony has evidence that must be presented to this assembly, evidence of human treachery and aggression." Elena's blood went cold as massive holographic displays flickered to life throughout the chamber, showing footage that should have been impossible to obtain. Human military exercises conducted in secret, prototype weapons being tested on remote moons, diplomatic communications between Earth's leaders discussing contingency plans. All of it was classified at the highest levels, and all of it had been stolen. But worse than the theft was what Zethkorin did with the information, twisting every image and every word into proof of human hostility, making defensive preparations look like invasion plans, making cautious discussions look like conspiracies against the Conquered. "As you can see," Zethkorin declared, "the humans have been preparing for war while pretending to seek peace, and we must ask ourselves, can such a species ever be trusted?" Elena activated her microphone to respond, to explain, to defend her people, but no sound came from her platform, and when she looked at the control panel, she saw that her speaking privileges had been revoked. She tried to signal the assembly moderators, but they ignored her completely, and around the chamber, species that she had thought were friendly began to rise and speak against humanity. The Rithani ambassador, whose people had traded with Earth for 20 years, called humans violent primitives barely evolved from their animal ancestors. The Alorian choir, a collective consciousness that had exchanged art and music with human cultures, declared that humanity was genetically unstable and prone to irrational aggression. The Kethvar Dominion, whose merchants had grown rich from human commerce, compared human lifespans to mayflies pretending at civilization, too short-lived to understand consequence or responsibility. And the assembly laughed. Elena stood frozen as thousands of alien voices filled the chamber with mockery, as species she had spent years building relationships with joined in the ridicule, as everything humanity had worked for crumbled around her. She tried again to speak, pressing every control on her platform, waving her arms to get attention, but the Conquered had decided that humanity would not be allowed to defend itself today. When Alina refused to stop trying, armed peacekeepers in gleaming armor approached her platform and escorted her to the edge of the chamber for her own protection. Their weapons not quite pointed at her, but close enough to make the threat clear. From the margins of the room, Alina watched as Zethkorin proposed Motion 7751, the indefinite suspension of humanity's voting rights, the placement of behavioral monitors on Earth itself, and the establishment of guidance councils to oversee all human activities in space. The vote was 3,847 in favor and 12 against, and Alina memorized the names of those 12 species who had stood with humanity when everyone else had abandoned them. As the assembly celebrated their victory over the dangerous humans, Alina's aide, a young man named David Chen, appeared at her side with tears of rage in his eyes. "Ambassador," he whispered, "what do we do now?" Alina did not answer immediately, for she was watching Zethkorin accept congratulations from his allies, watching the Rithani and Alorian and Kethvar delegates laugh together about the humiliation they had delivered, watching the galaxy show its true face. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and cold. "Contact the Meridian," she said, nomming humanity's diplomatic flagship that waited in orbit, "and tell Captain Morrison to prepare for immediate departure." "And then what?" David asked. Alina turned away from the celebration and walked toward the exit, her footsteps steady and measured despite everything that had just happened. "Then we remind the galaxy that they made a terrible mistake today." David followed her, confused by her composure, expecting anger or despair but finding neither. "Ambassador, they have 4,000 species and fleets beyond counting, and we have nothing compared to them. How can we possibly respond to this?" Alina stopped at the chamber doors and looked back one last time at the Grand Assembly, at all those ancient and powerful civilizations that had just declared humanity unworthy of respect. "They called us mayflies," she said quietly, "but they forgot something important about mayflies." "What's that?" Alina's expression was not one of defeat, and those who saw her face in that moment would later say it was the cold, quiet look of someone who had stopped pretending. "Mayflies may live short lives," she answered, "but when they swarm, they darken the sky." She walked out of the chamber without looking back, and behind her, the Galactic Concord continued its celebration, completely unaware that they had just triggered a response 37 years in the making. In the shuttle bay, Alina found Captain Morrison waiting with a security team, his face grim as he received reports from across conquered space. "Ambassador," he said, "word is spreading fast and our people are asking for instructions." Alina boarded the shuttle and took her seat, her hands folded in her lap like a woman at peace, despite the chaos around her. "Tell them to begin the silence," she ordered, "and contact Earth immediately. We need to speak with the United Council." Morrison's eyes widened as he recognized the protocol she was invoking, a protocol he had hoped would never be necessary, a protocol that meant humanity was done playing by the Concord's rules. "Are you certain?" he asked. Alina thought about the laughter in the chamber, about the microphone that had been cut, about 37 years of humiliation and condescension and broken promises. "They wanted to teach humanity its place in the galaxy," she said as the shuttle lifted off, "and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. We now know exactly where we stand, and more importantly, we know exactly what we have to do." The shuttle rose through the station's atmospheric shields and into the cold void of space, where the HSS Meridian waited like a sword ready to be drawn. Behind them, the lights of Ethon Prime glittered with celebration and triumph. By dawn, those lights would flicker with fear instead. For 6 hours after the vote, humanity went completely silent, and across the galaxy, every human vessel powered down its communication systems and refused to answer any hails. Ambassador Vasquez's shuttle docked with the HSS Meridian, and the moment she stepped aboard, the flagship cut all contact with the outside universe, becoming a ghost ship floating in the darkness near Ethon Prime. On the station below, Concord officials noticed the sudden quiet and laughed about it in their private chambers, calling it a tantrum, saying the primitives needed time to process their defeat, joking that humans were emotional creatures who could not handle disappointment with dignity. High Arbiter Zethkorin himself dismissed reports of the communication blackout with a wave of his clawed hand, telling his advisors that humanity would come crawling back within a day, begging for forgiveness and promising to be more obedient in the future. But as the hours passed, the laughter began to fade, replaced by confusion and then concern. The first problems appeared on Velthari Prime itself, the homeworld of the hegemony, where power grids that had functioned perfectly for centuries suddenly developed strange fluctuations that engineers could not explain. Then came reports from Rithani trading stations, where navigation beacons went dark across 17 major shipping lanes, stranding thousands of vessels in deep space without guidance. The Alorian choir found their communication networks filling with static and interference, their collective thoughts fragmenting as the technology that bound them together began to fail in ways that seemed almost deliberate. And on Ethon Prime, the Grand Assembly's translation systems started producing errors, turning diplomatic messages into nonsense, making it impossible for species to understand each other. Conquered technicians rushed to repair the damage, their best minds working frantically to restore systems that had never failed before, but everywhere they looked, they found the same impossible problem. Human code. For 37 years, human engineers had been embedded throughout Conquered infrastructure, hired because they worked cheap and because they had a talent for solving problems that stumped older species. Those engineers had been welcomed into power plants and communication hubs and navigation centers across the galaxy, trusted with access to systems that controlled everything from life support to weapons targeting. And in all that time, not once had anyone thought to check their work carefully, because who worried about the labor of primitives? Now those primitives had walked away from their posts simultaneously, and the systems they had built and maintained and improved were revealing secrets hidden deep in their foundations. Security protocols written in English locked out Conquered technicians from their own networks, demanding passwords that no one knew, threatening permanent shutdown if wrong answers were entered. Backup systems that human engineers had installed for safety turned out to contain kill switches that could disable entire sectors with a single command. Even the translation software that allowed the Conquered to function had been quietly modified over decades, its core algorithms dependent on human servers that were now refusing all connection requests. High Arbiter Zethkorin summoned his intelligence officers and demanded explanations, his scales flushing dark with fury as report after report confirmed the same terrifying truth. "You're telling me," he hissed, "that we allowed the humans to make themselves essential to our civilization." His chief advisor, an elderly Velthari named Khosrin who had served 4 arbiters before this one, could only bow his head in shame. "We thought they were being helpful," Khosrin admitted, "and we never imagined they were capable of such long-term planning. Their lives are so short that we assumed they could not think beyond a single generation." "Find a way to remove their code," Zethkorin ordered, "and purge their influence from our systems immediately." Hesitated before delivering the worst news of all. "My lord, our analysts have examined the human modifications, and they estimate that removing them completely would require rebuilding our entire technological infrastructure from the ground up. It would take centuries and cost more resources than the hegemony possesses." Zethkorin sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in, realizing that humanity had been waging a quiet war for decades, while the Conquered was too arrogant to notice. And then his communication panel flickered to life with an urgent message from Ethon Prime's sensor command. The human flagship Meridian had just opened its hangar bay, and Ambassador Vasquez was broadcasting on all frequencies. In the Meridian's war room, Alina stood before a holographic display that showed the chaos spreading across conquered space, watching as 37 years of patient preparation finally bore fruit. Captain Morrison stood beside her, his expression caught between pride and disbelief at what humanity had achieved. "The council session lasted 4 hours," Alina said without looking away from the display, "and they have authorized full implementation of contingency protocols. We are now operating under wartime rules." "What exactly does that mean?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Alina finally turned to face him, and her eyes held a fire that had been hidden behind diplomatic smiles for far too long. "It means we stop pretending to be weak," she said, "and we show the galaxy what happens when you humiliate humanity in front of 4,000 species." She walked to the communication console and began recording her message, her voice calm and clear as she addressed every being in conquered space. "This is Ambassador Alina Vasquez of the Terran Coalition," she began, "and I'm speaking to all species who witnessed the events in the Grand Assembly today." Morrison watched as her words were transmitted across the stars, knowing that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. "For 37 years, Alina continued, humanity has endured your contempt and your condescension, accepting insults that would have driven any other species to war, waiting for the day when you would finally see us as equals." She paused and allowed a small, cold smile to cross her face. "That day will never come," she said, "because we have finally understood that you will never respect us until you fear us, and so we have decided to give you something to fear." On Ethon Prime, Zethkorin watched the broadcast with growing horror as Alina began to reveal the true scope of human preparations. "You thought we were primitive," she said, "and you were wrong. You thought we were foolish, and you were wrong. You thought we were helpless, and you were catastrophically, irreversibly wrong." She transmitted a single coded phrase to every human asset in conquered space, and across the galaxy, men and women who had been waiting for this moment their entire lives finally received the order they had trained for. "Prometheus Protocol is active." Morrison felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized what that phrase meant, knowing that the next few hours would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy forever. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "once we do this, there is no going back." Alina nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the display that showed conquered space descending into chaos. "They took away our voice in the assembly," she replied, "and they thought that would silence us forever. Now they will learn that humanity has many ways of speaking, and some of them are very loud indeed." She turned back to her broadcast, ready to deliver the killing blow, ready to show the Galactic Conquered that the mayflies they had mocked were about to darken the sky. "To the 12 species who voted in our favor today," she said, her voice softening slightly, "know that humanity remembers its friends. To everyone else, I suggest you start running because dawn is coming, and when it arrives, everything you thought you knew about the galaxy will burn." The transmission ended, and silence fell over the Meridian's war room as the crew waited for what came next. In the distance, the lights of Ethon Prime flickered uncertainly, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, human fleets that had been hidden for decades began to move. 8 hours had passed since the humiliation in the Grand Assembly, and across the galaxy, billions of beings watched their screens with growing unease as Ambassador Vasquez prepared to address the conquered once more. This time, she did not stand on a lowered platform designed to remind her of human inferiority, but rather on the bridge of the HSS Meridian, surrounded by officers who had spent their careers preparing for this exact moment. She did not plead for understanding or beg for mercy or try to explain away the stolen intelligence that Zethkorin had used against humanity. Instead, she simply revealed the truth. The Galactic Concord has operated under a comfortable assumption for 12,000 years, Alina began, her voice carrying across every frequency in known space. And that assumption is that older species are automatically wiser, stronger, and more capable than younger ones. She smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. Humanity has never shared that assumption. She continued, and from the very first day we joined the Concord, we have been preparing for the moment when you would try to destroy us. The holographic displays around her flickered to life, showing data that made intelligence officers across the galaxy choke on their drinks. You stole what you thought were our secrets, Alina said, but you only found what we wanted you to find. The real secrets are somewhat more impressive. She began with the fleet yards. Hidden in the gravitational shadows of dead stars, far beyond the range of any conquered sensor network, humanity had been building warships for 20 years, constructing an armada in total secrecy, while the galaxy assumed they had nothing but a handful of patrol vessels. The display showed 12 separate construction facilities, each one producing dreadnoughts and cruisers and carriers using technology that the Conquered had never seen, technology that human scientists had developed in labs that officially did not exist. 47 dreadnoughts, Alina announced calmly, 212 cruisers, over 1,000 support vessels, and enough fighters to fill the sky of any world we choose, all built while you were laughing at our primitive little species. Zethkorin watched from his chambers on Ethon Prime, his scales turning pale as the numbers kept growing, as he realized that humanity had somehow assembled a fleet capable of challenging even the mighty Velthari hegemony. But Alina was not finished. Your intelligence services were very proud of themselves for stealing our military data, she said, but they never wondered why it was so easy to find. The truth is that we let them steal it, because we wanted you to think you knew our capabilities. She displayed the weapons systems that had not been in those stolen files, technologies that made conquered military analysts gasp in disbelief. Kinetic accelerators that could punch through any known shield system, energy weapons that operated on principles the Conquered had declared theoretically impossible, missiles that could think and adapt and hunt their targets across light years. We have been reading Velthari encrypted communications for 9 years, Alina added almost casually, and we know every secret the hegemony has tried to keep from us. We know about the rebellions you crushed, the species you exterminated, the treaties you violated when you thought no one was watching. Zethkorin felt his heart's pounding as his entire intelligence apparatus collapsed around him, as decades of careful secrets were exposed to the galaxy in moments. The evidence that High Arbiter Zethkorin presented today was deliberately planted, Alina revealed, designed to make humanity look aggressive while hiding our real intentions. He thought he was exposing our weakness, but he was actually proving how easily the Velthari can be manipulated. In chambers across the galaxy, representatives who had voted against humanity began to sweat as they wondered what other secrets the humans might know, what other lies they might have been fed over the years. But Alina saved the most devastating revelation for last. The Galactic Concord depends entirely on the gatework, she said, referring to the ancient network of artificial wormholes that made interstellar civilization possible. And your scientists have always believed that the gates are indestructible, permanent fixtures of the universe that nothing could ever threaten. She paused, letting the tension build, watching on her displays as billions of beings across the galaxy held their breath. Your scientists were wrong. The holographic display showed the results of experiments conducted in secret human facilities, experiments that demonstrated something the Conquered had declared impossible, a method to collapse artificial wormholes, to shut down the gates that connected the galaxy, to reduce interstellar civilization to isolated islands separated by centuries of travel time. "We can destroy the gatework," Alina announced. "All of it, every single gate, and without it, your empires will crumble into dust within a generation. Your fleets will be stranded, your economies will collapse, your peoples will starve." The Grand Assembly Chamber erupted into chaos as species that had been allies for millennia began screaming accusations at each other, as the careful order of 12,000 years disintegrated in moments. The Kethvar Dominion demanded immediate military action against humanity, while the Rithani called for emergency negotiations, while the Alorian choir simply fled the station entirely, their collective consciousness fragmenting under the pressure of impossible choices. High Arbiter Zethkorin tried to restore order, but no one was listening anymore, because everyone understood the terrible truth that Alina had just revealed. Humanity held the power of life and death over galactic civilization itself. "You called us mayflies," Alina said, her voice cutting through the chaos with cold precision. "And you mocked our short lives as proof of our inferiority, but you forgot something important." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with 37 years of suppressed rage. "Mayflies may live only for a day," she said, "but when they swarm, they can devour everything in their path. You had the chance to welcome us as equals, to build something together, to create a future that benefited all species." She shook her head slowly. "You chose humiliation instead," she continued. "And now you will learn that humanity does not forget, and humanity does not forgive, and humanity absolutely does not surrender." On Ethon Prime, Zethkorin finally found his voice and activated his personal communication channel, trying desperately to reach the human ambassador. "Vasquez," he said, his earlier arrogance completely gone, "surely we can discuss this like civilized beings. There must be some accommodation we can reach, some way to resolve this without destroying everything we have built." Alina looked at the communication request for a long moment before accepting it. "High Arbiter," she replied. 6 hours ago you cut my microphone when I tried to speak in the assembly. You denied me the basic dignity of a response while your allies mocked my species as animals." "A regrettable decision," Zethkorin admitted quickly, "made in the heat of the moment, and one I am willing to apologize for publicly if that would help." Alina laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "You still do not understand," she said, "and perhaps you never will. This was never about an apology, and it was never about accommodation." She gestured to her officers, who began transmitting coordinates to human vessels across the galaxy. "This is about teaching the conquered a lesson it should have learned 12,000 years ago," Alina said. "A lesson about respect and consequences, and the danger of underestimating beings you consider beneath you." She terminated the communication and turned to Captain Morrison. "Signal the fleet," she ordered, "and tell Admiral Okonkwo that we are ready to begin. It is time for the galaxy to meet the real humanity." In the darkness between stars, engines that had been cold for decades roared to life, and ships that had been hidden for a generation began their journey toward Ethon Prime. The reckoning was coming, and nothing in the universe could stop it now. The first human warship emerged from the void 2 hours after Alina's broadcast, appearing on Ethon Prime's sensors like a ghost materializing from darkness, and within minutes it was joined by another, and another, and another. They did not come through the gatework like civilized species were supposed to travel, but instead arrived through conventional faster-than-light drives, emerging from a direction that conquered astronomers had dismissed as empty space for thousands of years. Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the TCS Prometheus, watching through the viewport as his fleet assembled around the seat of galactic power, and he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction at the sight. 47 dreadnoughts arranged themselves in perfect formation, each one bristling with weapons that had never been tested in actual combat until now, their hulls painted black to match the void from which they had emerged. 200 cruisers spread out in supporting positions, their crews running final checks on systems that had been built specifically to counter conquered technology, while over 1,000 smaller vessels filled the gaps between them like a swarm of angry hornets. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Galactic Conquered faced an enemy that could challenge its supremacy. Admiral Okonkwo activated his communication system and broadcast a simple message to everyone within range of Ethon Prime. "This is Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo of the Terran Coalition Navy," he announced. His voice calm and professional despite the magnitude of the moment. "And I am speaking to all vessels and personnel currently present at this station." On Ethon Prime, billions of beings from thousands of species watched their displays with terror as the human fleet continued to grow, as ships kept emerging from directions that should have been impossible, as the reality of their situation became undeniable. "Any individual or vessel that wishes to depart this area peacefully has exactly 1 standard hour to do so," Okonkwo continued, "and I strongly encourage you to take this opportunity, because when that hour expires, we will no longer be accepting departures." He paused to let his words sink in. "This is not a negotiation," he added, "and there will be no second warning." Panic erupted across the station as species scrambled to reach their ships, as diplomats and merchants and tourists fought for places on evacuation shuttles, as the orderly civilization of the conquered dissolved into chaos and fear. The Velthari hegemony attempted to respond, scrambling their famous battle fleet to defend the station, but they immediately encountered the problems that human engineers had been building into their systems for decades. Communication networks that should have coordinated their movements instead produced contradictory orders, sending ships in wrong directions and creating confusion that spread faster than any commander could correct. Targeting computers that should have locked onto human vessels instead reported errors and malfunctions, their accuracy degraded by subtle modifications that had accumulated over 15 years of routine maintenance by human technicians. Even their engines betrayed them, running at reduced efficiency because of optimization algorithms that human programmers had quietly altered to favor fuel economy over speed. High Arbiter Zethkorin watched from his command center as his mighty fleet stumbled and faltered, as the pride of the Velthari hegemony proved helpless against an enemy that had been sabotaging them from within for a generation. "How is this possible?" he demanded of his admirals. "We have the largest military force in the galaxy, and you are telling me we cannot even coordinate a basic defensive formation." His senior admiral, a veteran of 100 campaigns, could only shake his head in despair. "The humans are everywhere," he reported, "and their code is in everything. Every system we try to use has been compromised, and we cannot fix it fast enough to matter." Zethkorin slammed his fist against his throne in fury, but there was nothing he could do except watch as species that had been loyal to the hegemony for millennia began abandoning their positions and fleeing for the gatework. The Kethvar Dominion tried to mount their own response, sending their warships to challenge the human fleet, but they discovered that their weapons could not hit targets accurately enough to matter, their shots going wide by margins that should have been impossible for their advanced technology. When their admirals investigated, they found the same corrupted code that plagued the Velthari, the same subtle sabotage that turned their mighty vessels into expensive targets. One by one, conquered species began reaching out to Admiral Okonkwo directly, trying to negotiate separate arrangements, offering tributes and alliances, and anything else they thought humans might want. Okonkwo directed them all to Ambassador Vasquez, who had established herself in a command center aboard the Meridian and was conducting the most important diplomatic negotiations in galactic history. She received representatives from a dozen species in the first hour alone, listening to their offers and excuses and desperate pleas, with the same cold expression she had worn when walking out of the Grand Assembly. "You had 37 years to treat humanity with basic respect," she told each delegation, "and you chose to laugh at us instead. Why should we believe that anything has changed?" Most delegations had no good answer for that question, and Alina dismissed them with instructions to contact her again when they had something meaningful to offer. But 12 delegations were different. Representatives from the 12 species that had voted in humanity's favor during the assembly, the small and overlooked peoples who had stood with Earth when everyone else had turned against them. To these delegations, Alina offered something unprecedented: full partnership in a new coalition, one that would replace the corrupt and arrogant Concord with something better, something built on mutual respect rather than ancient hierarchies. The Thesson Collective was first to accept, their ambassador weeping with relief as she signed the agreement that would bind her people to humanity's cause. The Morthani Wanderers followed, then the Kavari Federation, then species after species that had suffered under conquered rule for thousands of years, and finally saw a chance for freedom. By the time Admiral Okonkwo's deadline expired, 47 species had joined the newborn Terran coalition, and the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted forever. On his command bridge, Okonkwo received confirmation that all evacuation shuttles had cleared the danger zone, and that only hostile vessels remained near the station. "Admiral," his tactical officer reported, "the Velthari fleet is attempting to form a defensive line around Ethon Prime, and they are demanding that we withdraw or face destruction." Okonkwo studied the display for a moment, noting the gaps in the enemy formation, the confusion in their movements, the desperation in their positioning. "Target their command ship," he ordered calmly, "and fire a single warning shot across their bow. I want them to understand exactly how accurate our weapons are compared to theirs." The Prometheus's main cannon discharged with a sound like thunder, sending a beam of concentrated energy that passed within meters of the Velthari flagship, close enough to scorch its paint, but not close enough to cause actual damage. It was a message, and everyone who witnessed it understood exactly what it meant. The humans could destroy them at any time they chose, and the only reason they had not done so yet was because they were offering one final chance to surrender. The Velthari flagship immediately powered down its weapons and broadcast a request for terms. "Tell them to dock at the station and await further instructions," Okonkwo ordered, "and inform Ambassador Vasquez that the military phase of this operation is complete. The rest is politics." He looked out at the station that had once been the heart of galactic civilization, now surrounded by human warships, its defenders broken and its authority shattered. 37 years, he murmured to himself, and they never saw us coming. His executive officer smiled grimly. "They thought we were mayflies," she said, "and they forgot that mayflies can swarm." Okonkwo nodded slowly, then turned his attention to the reports flooding in from across the galaxy, where human assets were securing critical infrastructure and coalition allies were moving to claim their rightful positions. The old order was dying, and something new was being born in its place. And at the center of it all stood humanity, no longer begging for acceptance, no longer tolerating contempt, no longer pretending to be anything less than what they truly were. The reckoning had come, and the galaxy would never be the same. Dawn on Ethon Prime was artificial, a programmed sunrise that bathed the station in golden light every 32 standard hours, and when it came on this particular morning, the Grand Assembly Chamber was nearly empty. The vast dome that had once held representatives from 4,000 species now contained only scattered remnants, delegates too proud to flee, officials too slow to escape, and leaders too broken to do anything but wait for the end. High Arbiter Zethkorin sat on his elevated throne at the center of the chamber, his ceremonial robes disheveled, and his ancient scales dull with exhaustion, watching the entrance with eyes that had seen his entire world collapse in less than a single day. He had ruled the Velthari hegemony for 3 centuries, and had never once doubted that his species would dominate the galaxy forever. And now, he sat alone in a chamber that had become a tomb for everything he had believed in. The doors opened, and Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked in. She moved without hurry, her footsteps echoing through the empty space, passing platforms that had been occupied by humanity's enemies just hours before, climbing steps that led to the central podium where Zethkorin had orchestrated her humiliation. In her hands she carried a single physical document, actual paper bound in leather. An artifact so primitive that most galactic species had forgotten such things ever existed. It was the Treaty of Provisional Membership that humanity had signed 37 years ago, the document that had defined Earth's relationship with the conquered, the legal foundation of every restriction and limitation and humiliation that humans had endured. Captain Morrison accompanied her, along with a small honor guard of Coalition Marines, but Elena barely noticed them, her attention fixed entirely on the arbiter who watched her approach with something that might have been fear or might have been resignation. She reached the podium and stood there for a moment, looking out at the empty chamber, remembering how it had felt to stand in her designated place while thousands of voices laughed at her species. "You know," she said conversationally, "I practiced my speech for this hearing for 6 weeks. I rehearsed every word, anticipated every objection, prepared responses for every possible criticism." She placed the treaty on the podium before her. "I was so nervous," she continued, "because I genuinely believed that if I said the right things and made the right arguments, your assembly would see us as equals. I actually thought we could earn your respect through patience and diplomacy." She shook her head slowly, a sad smile crossing her face. "What a fool I was." Zethkorin stirred on his throne, some remnant of his old pride pushing him to respond. "We built civilization while your ancestors were still living in caves," he said, his voice hoarse but defiant, "and you expect us to treat you as equals after a few decades of membership." Elena looked at him with something that might have been pity. "No," she replied, "I no longer expect anything from the conquered, because I finally understand that respect is not something you can earn from those who have already decided to despise you." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small metal object, an antique lighter that gleamed gold in the artificial dawn light. "My grandfather carried this through the last great war on Earth," she said, examining it thoughtfully, "and when I was young, he told me something I never forgot." She opened the lighter and tested the flame, watching it dance in the still air of the chamber. "He said that some documents are worth dying for," she continued, "but other documents are only worth burning. The trick is knowing which is which." She looked at the treaty before her, at the pages that contained every legal justification for treating humanity as inferior, every clause that had been used to deny them rights that other species took for granted. "This treaty was never meant to lead to full membership," she said, "and we knew that from the beginning. We knew that the conquered would never accept us willingly, no matter how long we waited or how hard we tried." She touched the flame to the corner of the document and watched as it began to burn. "So we stopped waiting," she said, "and we stopped trying, and we started preparing for the day when we would take our place in the galaxy whether you liked it or not." The treaty caught fire and blazed brightly, illuminating Elena's face, as she watched centuries of careful legal framework turn to ash and smoke. Zethkorin watched with horror as the document that bound humanity to the conquered disintegrated before his eyes. "You cannot simply dissolve a galactic treaty," he protested weakly, "and there are procedures and protocols and proper channels for these things." Elena laughed, and there was genuine amusement in the sound. "Your fleet is scattered and broken," she replied. "Your infrastructure is crippled by code you cannot remove. Your allies have abandoned you, and 47 species have already joined our coalition. Who exactly is going to enforce your procedures and protocols?" She let the last burning remnants of the treaty fall to the podium, where they crumbled into nothing. "As of this moment," she announced in a voice that carried to every recording device in the chamber and was broadcast across the galaxy, "humanity declares all obligations to the Galactic Conquered null and void. We withdraw from your organization completely and permanently." She turned to address any remaining delegates in the chamber, her voice ringing with authority. "Any species that wishes to establish diplomatic relations with the Terran coalition may do so," she declared, "but only on terms of mutual respect and equality. We will not be your juniors, we will not accept your monitors, and we will not tolerate your condescension ever again." She looked back at Zethkorin, who seemed to have aged 1,000 years in a single night. "The gatework will remain operational," she said, "for now, but humanity reserves the right to close any gate at any time for any reason, and if you test our patience again, we will not hesitate to use that power." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You have 12 standard months to remove all behavioral monitors and military assets from human space," she added. "And if you have not completed this withdrawal by then, we will remove them ourselves in ways you will find extremely unpleasant." Zethkorin finally rose from his throne, his ancient body trembling with a combination of exhaustion and despair. "You have destroyed 12,000 years of galactic order," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and you have plunged the galaxy into chaos that may take centuries to resolve." Alina met his gaze without flinching. "No," she replied calmly, "we have simply stopped pretending that your order was ever worth preserving. The Conquered was built on domination and contempt, and it deserved to fall." She gestured to the ashes scattered across the podium. "This is what remains of your authority over humanity," she said, "and this is what will remain of any species that tries to humiliate us again. We came to you as friends, and you chose to make us enemies, and now you will live with the consequences of that choice." She turned and began walking toward the exit, her honor guard falling into formation around her. Behind her, Zethkorin sank back onto his throne, staring at the ashes that swirled in the artificial breeze of the climate control systems, understanding at last how completely he had underestimated the species he had dismissed as primitives. Ambassador Vasquez paused at the chamber doors and looked back one final time at the empty Grand Assembly, at the platforms where thousands had gathered to mock humanity, at the throne where the High Arbiter sat broken and defeated. "You called us mayflies," she said, "and you laughed at our brief lives, but you forgot that brief lives burn brightest, and the brightest flames leave the deepest marks." She walked out of the chamber without another word, leaving behind only ashes and the echoes of a galactic order that would never rise again. Above the station, human warships maintained their silent vigil as the artificial sun completed its programmed arc across the dome. And across the galaxy, billions of beings woke to a universe fundamentally changed from the one they had known before. Humanity had entered the galactic stage as supplicants, begging for scraps of recognition from species that considered them beneath contempt. They left it as conquerors, coalition builders, and architects of a new order that would reshape civilization for millennia to come. And in the ashes of burned treaties and shattered assumptions, a simple truth remained. Never underestimate a species that has learned to turn its brief existence into an eternal flame. The mayflies had swarmed, and the sky would never look the same again.